And so the NATO policy, the NATO strategy against Russia is use the Turks from the south, from the Middle East, and also from southeastern Europe, and then use the Germans to attack the Russians from the west. And it's a sort of pincer strategy. And so you see the Americans utilizing these two big regional powers, Germany and Turkey, which historically, and this is not a coincidence, historically have been the biggest enemies of the Russians. We are seeing the final throes of the American empire. And so what is America doing? They're saying, okay, listen, we have to empower the Turks. We have to empower the Germans. But because America is empowering these countries, who's to say that these countries are not just going to go rogue and do whatever the hell they want? Look at the whole freaking Epstein situation. Trump doesn't want to release that list, and it has been a huge embarrassment for Donald Trump. And so now this has caused a massive point of contention within the MAGA movement, and it has caused a massive stir of controversy in American society, because now the question is, wait a second, who controls our politicians? Yes, free Palestine, but Palestine has freed us all, because Palestine has gotten us to realize that our country is controlled by Israel. Israel, the Mossad, controls our politicians. Our politicians are being controlled by a foreign power. And so what is this doing? It is getting people to hate Israel even more, and Israel is losing its edge. It's losing its popularity, and you are seeing a massive wave of antagonism and hatred towards Israel. Hasbara is dead. That is the bottom line. Hasbara is dead. So the Americans are pushing for this revival of German militarism. Meanwhile, they're pushing for German nationalism, regardless of the fact that German nationalism is filled with Nazis. So in both sides of this strategy, the German side and the Turkish side, you see people who hate Jews, and you see people who hate Israel. The Americans are empowering both of them, and so you see this perfect storm being done at the behest of the United States, and at the end of the day, this is to the demise of Israel. All right, everyone, so let's talk about the war in Ukraine and how the Americans are using the Turks and the Germans as proxies against the Russians. So let's first get a little bit into this whole war in Ukraine. The NATOists will want you to think that Russia invaded Ukraine without any sort of provocation coming out of NATO. NATO never did anything to provoke the Russians into invading Ukraine. NATO was never encroaching into Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. And that Putin just decided to invade a country. He just woke up in the morning, he had some black tea, and perhaps there's something in Russian black tea that convinces people to become dictators. Perhaps there's something in the black tea that gets people to want to invade a country, but just Putin, he just woke up and he decided to invade Ukraine. But if you actually take the time to look into the origin story of the war in Ukraine, you will see that for the longest time, the Russians were telling NATO, listen, NATO, do not expand into Eastern Europe. We will allow you guys to make Germany into a member of NATO, but do not expand any further. And the Americans made this promise. There was German reunification, and they said, allow Germany to become a member of NATO. And Russia said, okay, we're going to leave Eastern Europe, but do not expand eastward at all. You guys have Germany, and that is it. Do not expand into our sphere of influence, into our sphere of interest. And the Americans kept giving the Russians assurances, and they were lies. They were all false assurances, because NATO actually continued to expand eastward, and they just kept doing it. And the Russians kept telling them, listen, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Stop messing with our sphere of influence. Stop doing this. You're messing with us geopolitically. You're not respecting us. Russia demands respect, and when you disrespect a superpower long enough, guess what? He's going to strike back, because a part of being a superpower is making sure that other countries respect you. And if you cannot maintain that respect, guess what? You no longer maintain your position as a superpower. So Russia struck back and invaded Ukraine. So now we have this whole publicity campaign that's been going on for years, making it seem like Russia is this evil, despotic country that just decided to invade a country out of nowhere, and that's just all a bunch of bullshit. But now what do you see? You see the Germans reviving their military strength, and you see the Turks reviving their old empire. And it's quite amazing to see this. If you look at a map, it's quite interesting. Turkey is a Black Sea country. It's right across from Ukraine, and Ukraine is in the northern part of the Black Sea. Turkey is on the southern part of the Black Sea. And so Turkey, being a Black Sea country and also being right across from Ukraine and also being right next to Russia, means that Turkey is NATO's most important member when it comes to the war against the Russians, just given the fact that it is a Black Sea country. But also, another very important member for NATO against the Russians is Germany, because historically Germany has been the biggest enemy of Russia in Europe, in really Western Europe, Northern Europe, Central Europe. Germany has been historically the big nemesis of the Russians, but also the Turks. So historically, the biggest enemies of the Russians have been the Turks and the Germans. And if you want to get into the German-Turkish history of being enemies, you can just go look into the Russo-Ottoman Wars. And the Turks lost a lot of territory thanks to the Russians, especially if you look into the Russo-Ottoman War back in the 1870s. The Russians allied with the Serbs against the Ottomans and defeated the Ottomans and enabled Serbia to become an independent country, and thus forcing the Ottomans to lose a significant amount of territory in the Balkans. The Turks have never forgotten this, and let's also not forget how the Turks tried to invade Armenia, and the Armenians won, even though the Armenians had a super small military and they were completely outnumbered by the Ottoman forces. The Armenians actually defeated the Turks, and the Armenians are an ally to the Russians. And so the Turks never forgot this very humiliating defeat, and they also never forgot the fact that they never completed the Armenian genocide, so they want to resume from where they left off. So the Turks want to control all of the South Caucasus. That would mean encroaching upon Russia's sphere of influence in the South Caucasus, and so also a part of Ukraine, believe it or not, used to belong to the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks, wanting to revive their empire, also see Ukraine in their crosshairs. And remember, there is a Turkic minority called Crimeans, or Crimean Tatars, who live in Ukraine, specifically in the Crimea region, which is controlled by Russia. So the Turks want to revive their empire, and if they are going to successfully revive their empire, they're going to have to enter into a war with the Russians. That would mean Turkey rivaling with the Russians over the South Caucasus. That would mean also the Russians and the Turks fighting over Crimea. So NATO sees this and they say, listen, Turkey is an extremely important member of our alliance. Also, and I've talked about this a million times, but I will continue to emphasize on this fact because geopolitically it is very pertinent to the discussion. The Turks controlled the access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean being an extremely important maritime territory. And so the Russians want unfettered access. They want complete free access into the Mediterranean from the Black Sea, and that would mean either making a very strong alliance with the Turks or just removing Turkish power altogether. So NATO needs Turkey as a member of its alliance in order to use Turkey as a proxy to control Russia's access into the Mediterranean from the Black Sea, and thus forcing Russia to be locked into the Black Sea. And that would further isolate Russia, and that would further preclude Russia from gaining any sort of it would preclude Russia from gaining further influence in the region. So Turkey is an extremely valuable member of NATO for this very reason. So you have Turkey in the southeast, and Turkey is being used as a proxy against the Russians. This is the reason why you see the Americans praising Al-Qaeda. Now, remember growing up as a kid back in middle school, if you were born in the 1990s like me, you were told that Al-Qaeda was the big bad boogeyman and that America was out there fighting Al-Qaeda in the valorous, valiant, glorious war on terror. And then as you got older and you began to read about the history of the CIA with Al-Qaeda, you started to become disillusioned with your own damn country, and that really is the fault of the United States overall. And then you began to realize that it was all bullshit, and you were being fed bullshit for much of your life, and that has built quite a lot of resentment within you. And, you know, I speak for a lot of people when I say this, but now we see Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, who was Al-Qaeda. And this guy was wanted by the American government, and the U.S. had a $10 million bounty on Ahmed al-Shara. And guess what? Now Ahmed al-Shara is the president of Syria, but really he's just a puppet of NATO. And all of a sudden, Al-Qaeda ain't that bad. That $10 million reward, that $10 million bounty, oh, forget about it. Forget about it. We were looking for you, but now we've appointed you to be the president of Syria, which means that we knew where you were all along. So he's a puppet of the CIA. He's a puppet of the Mossad. The Israelis are working with him. And you see the reality of Turkish control in Damascus. So this is really the revival of Turkish power, and this is the beginning stages of the Neo-Ottoman Empire. And this is America using Turkey as a proxy, using Turkey as a weapon against the Russians in the Middle East. Now, let's go to Germany, because a part of American foreign policy is to control both the Middle East and Europe. And the number one proxy for the Americans within the European continent has been Germany. This has been the case since the Cold War. And in the post-Cold War era, this continues to still be the case. And the Americans, they want to control Germany. This is why you have tens of thousands of American troops stationed in Germany. The Americans want to control Germany, but at the same time, they want to use Germany as a proxy against the Russians. Well, how do you do that? You have to enable the Germans to revive their military strength. But how do you do that without the risk of enabling Germany to go rogue? How do you revive German military power without the prospect of Germany being unleashed? The unleashing of Deutschland, which sounds like a song in some German metal band, Rammstein or some shit like that. And so you see the Americans just pushing for German militarism. You see this all the time. We've been seeing this for years, but we especially began to see this sort of rhetoric, this sort of discourse coming out of Washington getting more and more intensified, more and more amplified during Brexit, after Brexit. And then, the British voted to leave the EU, and guess what? The biggest European funder for the EU's defense was no longer in the EU. So the British, because they were such a significant member of the EU, and because they were pouring so much money in the EU's defense, the British had a lot of say-so in the EU. They had a lot of say-so when it came to European defense strategy. And the Germans were saying, listen, let's create this EU army. It'll be a great idea. We'll have the German military joining forces with the French military and the British military. And the British for years were saying, no, no, no. And David Cameron was saying, no, 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 no. We're not going to allow this. And so the British were a big obstacle to German aspirations of reviving militarism in Europe. But then the British voted to leave. So then what happened pretty much right after Brexit? The Germans had a big old fat meeting, and they said, we're going to work together with the French to create this EU army. But the reality was that they were really talking about a massive German military force with a French partner, and then you would have all these European auxiliaries, excuse me. So the reason why Germany has always seen itself as the potential strongest military force in Europe is very simple, because Germany has the biggest economy in Europe. And if you have the biggest economy, you have the biggest potential, the biggest capacity to become the biggest military in your neighborhood, in your region. And so that is why for a number of years now, especially since 2022 with Olaf Scholz, we've been seeing the Germans talking about becoming the biggest military force in Europe. And guess what? It's going to happen. Why is it going to happen? Because the Americans want it to happen. That is why. The Americans want militarism to be revived. The Americans want German militarist fanaticism to be revived. And they want nationalism to be revived. How do I know this? Well, look at the various figures in the German government currently. For example, the top general of the German armed forces is a guy by the name of Christian Freuding. Christian Freuding is a fanatic. The guy is a German militarist fanatic. You can see it in his eyes. The guy has murder in his eyes. He looks like someone just took an SS officer, put him on a time machine, and then brought him here to our time. And he looks like an absolute fanatic because he is. And I've talked about this several times, but I'll say this again because it is quite relevant. The Germans have a custom of celebrating victory over the Nazis, even though they were once the Nazis. But, as a gesture of saying we hate Nazism, the Germans celebrate the defeat of the Nazis, which is great. And on this particular day, Christian Freuding wasn't in Germany. He was actually in Ukraine, hanging out with some Ukrainian neo-Nazi who is a member of the Azov battalion, which is currently integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces. The guy is a fanatic. And then recently, Christian Freuding said that Germany is going to be giving long-distance missiles to the Ukrainians. Why is this? Because the Germans are reviving their military power. In fact, they have made this very clear several times. Boris Pistorius has talked about this several times. In fact, recently, Boris Pistorius stated that Germany is now prepared to kill Russian soldiers, and the Germans have talked about making nuclear weapons. And the Americans know this. In fact, there is a document that you can read from 2008, which came from U.S. Congress. And in 2008, the American government, through the U.S. Congress, declared that if the Germans ever get the impression that they cannot rely on the Americans, they will become a nuclear-armed country. They will actually pursue nuclear armament. So the Americans have been giving what impression to the Germans? What type of impression has Donald Trump given to the Germans in recent years? That the Americans cannot be relied upon, that the Americans cannot be trusted. And so the Germans are saying, we can't trust the Americans. I mean, you have Donald Trump saying that if the Germans don't pay their fair share for Europe's defense, for NATO's defense, that America will not defend Germany in the case of a Russian war, in the case of a Russian invasion of Germany. So what did this do? It created an atmosphere of distrust towards the Americans. Whether or not that was done on purpose, I don't know. But nonetheless, the impression was made and the psychological effect is there. And so for years now, the Germans have been talking about pursuing military independence. In the years 2018 and 2017, I got those years reversed, Angela Merkel stated that basically the days of Germany trusting the Americans are over. The days of Germans relying on the Americans and the British are over. And so we have been seeing within recent years, really since this past decade, the Germans working on reviving their military strength. And that's why you see this fanatic Christian Freuding leading the German armed forces. That's why you see this nationalist wave in Germany. In fact, I suspect, and I can't prove this, I don't have the white paper that says, this is the policy, this is the conspiracy, but I suspect that the 2015 migrant crisis was actually a conspiracy done by NATO to revive German nationalism. And it worked. And even if it wasn't a conspiracy, the effect actually happened, and German nationalism was revived. And we are currently seeing this huge, intense wave of German right-wing politics in Germany. That is why the second biggest party in Germany is a nationalist party, the Alternative for Deutschland party. Make no mistake about it, the AfD is not about peace. The AfD is not about pacifism. The AfD is about war. And that is why its most famous leader, Björn Höcke, has talked about reviving German military strength, and he has also talked about making the German military independent of American power. So with America's backing of Germany's militarist revival comes a risk of Germany going rogue, and that actually could happen. If it happens, whether or not, regardless, at the end of the day, America is going to be using Germany as a weapon against the Russians. And so the NATO policy, the NATO strategy against Russia is use the Turks from the south, from the Middle East, and also from southeastern Europe, and then use the Germans to attack the Russians from the west. And it's a sort of pincer strategy. And so you see the Americans utilizing these two big regional powers, Germany and Turkey, which historically, and this is not a coincidence, historically have been the biggest enemies of the Russians. And this is not, so it's not coincidental that the Americans are using these two powers against the Russians, just given the history of violence that they have with Russia. I actually want to read to you guys some excerpts from this book that I'm currently reading. It is called Provoked by Scott Horton. So far, it has been very informative. It is about the history of the Russian-Ukrainian war and how the Americans provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine. And I just want to give you guys some more details about what I was talking about earlier in the video. So it talks about, and this is really interesting, it talks about really how America provoked the Russians, how America lied to the Russians. And so it says here, it speaks here about the foreign minister of West Germany in 1990. His name was Hans Dietrich Genscher. And Genscher made assurances to the Russians that NATO did not have the intention of expanding eastward. And so the Americans and the Germans were giving these assurances to the Russians. Now, perhaps Mr. Genscher was sincere. It doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, these assurances came to naught. And so it says here that on January 31st, 1990, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher gave a public speech in Bavaria, taking the same stance on reunification. The U.S. Embassy wrote home to Secretary of State James Baker, and James Baker will become a very significant figure. And so it says here that the U.S. Embassy wrote home to Secretary of State James Baker that though he said a reunited Germany would be a part of NATO, Genscher makes it clear that the changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process must not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. So the Germans were saying, we're going to become a part of NATO, we're going to reunify, but we need to make sure that we don't give this impression to the Russians that NATO is going to expand any further east, because we don't want to make it seem like we're encroaching on Russia's sphere of influence. So Genscher went on to say that therefore NATO should rule out an expansion of its border towards the east, i.e. moving it closer to Soviet borders. He instead recommended, quote, cooperative security structures, unquote, for all of Europe. So then it goes on to say that Genscher also called for a partnership of stability between East and West to be achieved through the CSCE, or the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which the USSR was already a member. So the Germans were saying, listen, we can maintain peace with the Soviets by just working with the Soviets through the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the CSCE, and therefore we don't have to pursue this idea of expanding NATO eastward, because that's only going to piss off the Russians and that would lead to nothing good. So let's just work with the Russians, let's maintain peace. But no, these are the Americans that we're dealing with, and you had these neoconservatives, these Zionists, and they were all Zionists, make no mistake about it. You had these Zionists, people like Paul Wolfowitz, saying, no, we have to expand further in Europe because we have to control Europe because America is now an empire. And in fact, this was heavily expressed by people like Charles Krauthammer. Charles Krauthammer, hot damn, that guy was an absolute warmonger. He used to come on Fox News all the time, and we used to think, well, you know, he's this very decent guy, very soft-spoken man, blah, blah, blah. But Charles Krauthammer was freaking evil, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Charles Krauthammer would go on to write that now is the time for America to become a global empire. We have to control Europe. Let's enter the Middle East. Now is the time. Russia is weak. The Russian Soviet Empire has fallen. Now is the time to form our empire. And they basically had this idea that the American empire could last forever. It could just control Europe, control the Middle East without any sort of issues, without any sort of pushback from the Russians or any other power, and it will just last forever. And it's like how the Germans talked about a 1,000-year Reich. The Americans were talking about their own sort of 1,000-year global hegemony, this 1,000-year American empire. And they said, now is the time. Hit the metal when it's hot. And so what has happened? Because of America's arrogance, the world is turning on the American empire, because the Americans thought we will last forever. Our empire will last forever. And has that been the case? The Americans entered Iraq thinking the Iraqis will love us, the Iraqis will revere us, they will do whatever we say. And how did that end up? America listened to these terrible ideas, listened to these terrible advisors, listened to the whims of these insane Zionists, and ended up in a forever war in Iraq. And just to give you guys an example of this sort of arrogance, John Kiriakou, who was a member of the CIA, has a really funny story. He says that one day he was in this government building, and he passed by this room, and he saw this American official scribbling something, doodling something on a piece of paper. So he thought to himself, okay, what is this guy doodling? So he goes into this room, and he takes a little peek at what this guy is doodling, and he sees this guy is drawing out this flag, this fictitious artificial flag. And he's coloring in the lines, and he's making this flag that has yellow, blue, and white colors. And John Kiriakou said, what the hell are you doing? And this guy said, oh, I'm just I'm just drawing the Iraqi flag, the new Iraqi flag. Now that we've taken over Iraq and we've defeated Saddam Hussein, we're going to rebuild Iraq, make it into a brand new country, and we're going to establish democracy, and the Iraqis love us, and so we're going to make for them a new flag. And John Kiriakou said, are you using blue, yellow, and white for this new Iraqi flag? And he said, yeah, blue, yellow, and white. And John Kiriakou said, that's the colors of Israel. Why are you using the colors of Israel for this new Iraqi flag that you have in your head? Why would the Iraqis accept such a flag? And he said, oh, yeah, you're right. I'm mimicking the Israeli flag. Because we want to make Iraq look like Israel. We want to recreate Iraq so that it'll become another Israel. And John Kiriakou said, you do realize that the flags of the Arab countries have particular colors because those colors mean something to the Arabs. You have red, white, black, green. These colors mean something. Green means Islam, etc., etc. They're not just going to accept these colors because you tell them to. And John Kiriakou said, this was the type of insanity that I saw in the U.S. government. And he has another really funny story wherein he was observing this meeting. It was his job to write down notes on these meetings in regards to America's progress in the Iraq War. And this was during the time when the Iraq War was very new. And he said that he was observing this meeting and he was jotting down notes and he was, I guess, recording the minutes for the meeting, something like that. And he said, I was listening to this American military official of some sort, and he was giving this report, and he said, yes, our men are in Iraq, and in several weeks, our soldiers will be marching through Tehran. And there was someone next to John Kiriakou who said, excuse me, did he say Baghdad or Tehran? He said Tehran, sir. And he said, have these people lost their damn minds? Yes, sir, they have. This is the type of arrogance that was being exhumed by the Americans. We're going to be marching through Tehran. No one can stop us, etc., etc. And we've destroyed several countries because of our arrogance. We've destroyed Iraq. We've destroyed Syria. We have destroyed Libya. We have made Libya into like that post-apocalyptic movie where that Mel Gibson was in. What was it? I forgot the name of it. But Mel Gibson plays in this apocalyptic film, post-apocalyptic movie. Libya has become essentially that. It's just a nightmare. There's still people killing each other in Libya. You still have factious violence between various factions in Libya. It's a freaking nightmare. And that was because we overthrew Gaddafi. And who was pushing for the overthrowing of Gaddafi? Israel and its Zionist acolytes in the United States. And so we have made the Middle East into a nightmare. We have made really a dystopia out of the Middle East, all for the sake of the American empire and for Israel. And so this goes back to American foreign policy. We thought we can control the Middle East. We can control Europe. And so we didn't really care what Russia had to say. We really didn't care about Russia's request not to expand further east. We just kept doing it because we thought no one can stop us. We listened to people like Charles Krauthammer. And then what happened? The Russians said, listen, stop. Boom, invasion of Ukraine. And now we're complaining about Russia. And now we see BRICS. We see Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, India in a sort of coalition against American power. And India is sort of playing both sides. You know, they want to be an American ally, but at the same time, they love that Russian energy and they love the cheap Russian grain. But Russia is really going against the American empire. And so what are we seeing? We saw the Americans withdraw out of Iraq. We saw the Americans withdraw out of Afghanistan. And really, what did we witness? We witnessed the beginning stages of the downfall of the American empire. And it's going to continue on. So America right now is working within the throes of its end. We are seeing the final throes of the American empire. And so what is America doing? They're saying, okay, listen, we have to empower the Turks. We have to empower the Germans. But because America is empowering these countries, who's to say that these countries are not just going to go rogue and do whatever the hell they want? Now, case in point, Armenia is our ally, or one of our allies in the South Caucasus. But Turkey is also a major ally. Turkey is, in the eyes of NATO, a much more important geostrategic ally than Armenia is. Azerbaijan is also a very important geostrategic ally, just given the fact that it borders with Iran. It hates Iran, so America can use Azerbaijan against the Iranians. This is why the Israelis back the Azerbaijanis. And Turkey backed Azerbaijan in a war against Armenia because the Armenians were controlling Nagorno-Karabakh. The international community, for the most part, recognizes Nagorno-Karabakh as a part of Azerbaijan. So the Americans said, listen, allow the Turks to back the Azeris to take over Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's exactly what happened in 2020. In the middle of this COVID crisis, where we were all supposed to be wearing masks, you had Azeri soldiers in Nagorno-Karabakh killing Armenians. Horrendous war crimes were done, and over 100,000 Armenians were ethnically cleansed out of Nagorno-Karabakh. America really didn't say much. They did say, they did wave their finger at the Turks and at the Azeris, but the Azeris just laughed it off because it meant really nothing. It means shit, because Azerbaijan and Turkey are geostrategic allies for NATO, and NATO needs to have Turkey to control Russia's access into the Mediterranean from the Black Sea. And so we didn't give a shit if Azerbaijan committed war crimes. We didn't give a damn if Turkey enabled the Azeri war crimes in Nagorno-Karabakh. We didn't give a damn, because we need those countries to maintain our empire. So we need Turkey to maintain our empire. So what happens if Turkey just says, hey, listen, we want to, do a bunch of war crimes. We want to, resume from where we left off in the Armenian genocide. America's not going to say a damn thing. We literally have videos of Armenian civilians being beheaded. We literally have videos of Armenian civilians being executed by Azeri troops. And we didn't really do a damn thing. Israel didn't do a damn thing. I mean, the Israelis are always talking about how never again should a Holocaust happen, but we saw Armenians being butchered at the behest of the Americans and the Israelis. We saw Armenian civilians being butchered with the support of Israel. These countries don't really give a damn. And so Turkey can go rogue, and America's not going to do a damn thing about it because America needs Turkey. And so Turkey hates Israel. And this is the big... to use a term from Piers Morgan, this is the big moral quandary that America is facing. It needs Turkey, but at the same time, it needs Israel. It needs Israel to be America's foothold in the Middle East. Israel, as Alex Jones said many years ago, is sort of a glorified American airstrip. So we need Israel, but at the same time, we need Turkey. We need Turkey to control the Russians in the Black Sea, but we also need the Israelis to be our airstrip in the Middle East. So what's going to happen? How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to maintain relations with these countries when Turkey hates Israel and vice versa? And both countries are preparing for a war against each other. Turkey is accelerating its production of long-range missiles to prepare for a war against Israel. The Israelis are preparing for a potential war with Turkey. So what are the Americans going to do? They need both countries. They're not going to stop the Turks going to war with the Israelis. They need the Turks to control Russia's access into the Mediterranean Sea. So Turkey's just going to say, listen, Israel is messing with our sphere of influence. They keep provoking us. We want to control Syria. Syria is within our sphere of influence. We used to control Syria. The Israelis keep provoking us. The Israelis bombed one of the air bases that we want to control in Syria, and this actually did happen. Israel bombed the airstrip outside of one of these air bases that Turkey wants to control in Syria. So the Turks are going to say, listen, we can't just let Israel do whatever it wants against us and not us do anything about it, because we need to maintain our respect. We need to maintain our position as a regional power in the Middle East. We're not going to allow this. And so eventually there's going to be a war. And I suspect that the Turks are just going to make Israel into one giant Auschwitz. I don't say this with glee. YouTube, please don't flag this video. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I abhor genocide. I abhor mass murder. I abhor war crimes. But I'm simply giving you my prognostication, my observation of the future based on history. And so I think the Turks are going to force Israel to become a giant concentration camp, much like how the Israelis have made Gaza into a concentration camp. The Turks are going to do the same thing to the Israelis. I think the Iranians are also going to join in on this. And it's going to be a disaster. And the world is going to say F Israel. That's just the bottom line. because the bottom line is Hospira is dead. I talked about this in my last live stream. Hospira is dead. What is Hospira? Hospira is just Israeli propaganda. And you see tons of people hating on Israel. The war in Gaza has really amplified this hatred. And you see people, I've heard this actually said, that people have been screaming free Palestine, but the reality is that Palestine has freed all of us. This is what I read. I'm not saying I agree with this, but Palestine has freed all of us because Palestine has pushed people to come to the realization that Israel has tremendous power over the world, that Israel has tremendous power over the United States. And to really further shed light on this phenomenon, look at the whole freaking Epstein situation. Epstein, let's be real here. Epstein was nothing but a Jewish pimp. That's what the guy was. He was a pimp. He pimped out young girls, and he had this island, basically Pleasure Island. That's what it was. He had his own Pleasure Island, and he was getting these American politicians, he was flying them over into Pleasure Island. He was allowing them to indulge in whatever sick fantasies they had. And then he had all their names on a list. And that list was used as blackmail. That's essentially what was happening. That list was used, and it was used as blackmail, and it's still being used as blackmail because Donald Trump still refuses to release the Epstein list, to release the Epstein files. Why? Because a bunch of people's names are on that list, a bunch of people who don't want to be exposed. And so that damn list is not going to be released. Maybe they will release an abridged version of it. I don't know. But Trump doesn't want to release that list. And it has been a huge embarrassment for Donald Trump because Donald Trump said that he was going to release the list. And then he said, no, I'm not going to release the list. And so now this has caused a massive point of contention within the MAGA movement, and it has caused a massive stir of controversy in American society because now the question is, wait a second, who controls our politicians? Is it the American voters or is it Israel? Is it the American people or is it the Mossad? Who is it? And you find out that Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's girlfriend and partner in crime, had connections to the Mossad. So now people are saying, wait, what the hell is going on? And I saw recently a debate, and this is really a great example of how Israeli propaganda is losing its edge. It's losing its influence over the American populace. I saw this debate recently between some host on the Patrick Bet-David show and a co-host of the PPD podcast. His name is I think his name is Adam Sosnick, and this guy is an Israeli hospitalist. He's an Israeli propagandist. Adam Sosnick said, well, I don't understand. Why are people so obsessed with this whole Epstein story?
If Epstein worked for Mossad and the whole thing was a blackmail from the start, who's holding all the cards?
Why are people so obsessed with this story? Like, what are you hoping to find? There's a lot of people that are obsessed with this. A lot of these people are what I would call losers. They have nothing going on in their life, but this shiny little object they are obsessed with. And I'm not deflecting.
But Adam, that guy that's drinking Mountain Dew in his trailer and sitting there, who's an American patriot that pays his taxes and has kids and a family, Adam, he wants to know if the government that he's living under is controlled by foreign countries because they have tapes of them kids.
This Armenian guy on the PPD podcast said, hey, the reason why people care so much about this story is because people are wondering, wait a second, who controls our politicians? Is a foreign power controlling our politicians? That's why people are obsessing over this story. It's not because we're just obsessing over it for the sake of obsessing over it. It's because we realize, oh my God, Israel, the Mossad, controls our politicians. Our politicians are being controlled by a foreign power. And so what is this doing? It is getting people to hate Israel even more, and Israel is losing its edge. It's losing its popularity, and you are seeing a massive wave of antagonism and hatred towards Israel. Hospira is dead. That is the bottom line. Hospira is dead. And so people are hating on Israel. They don't give a shit about Israel. Tucker Carlson is more famous than he has ever been in his whole career because he was fired from Fox News and now he's been criticizing Israel. And then recently Tucker Carlson said, if you're an American citizen and you fight for the IDF, you should lose your citizenship. And guess what? Almost everyone agrees with Tucker Carlson now. Now, I remember the first time I ever heard about this phenomenon of American citizens fighting for the IDF, I was in middle school. And I was actually shocked. I was in middle school or high school. It was either freshman year or 8th grade. I was young. Okay, I was a teenager. And I had a lot of Israeli friends. And I used to hang out with these Israeli people. And I remember this one Israeli guy who was around my age telling me, oh, my sister is in the IDF. And I remember thinking in my mind, wait, aren't you guys Americans? Weren't you guys born here? Why the hell is your sister fighting for a foreign power? And I was told before this that it is illegal to fight for a foreign military. So I thought, why are American citizens fighting for Israel? I guess this was one of the first seeds planted in me that got me to be disillusioned by Israel. And then you hear about the Israeli war crimes, shooting Palestinians at freaking aid distribution centers, using Palestinians as human shields. And people are saying, yes, free Palestine, but Palestine has freed us all because Palestine has gotten us to realize that our country is controlled by Israel. And it's a good thing to realize that Israel has done atrocities and continues to still do atrocities. It is vital and absolutely necessary for us to expose Israeli war crimes, because all war crimes should be exposed regardless of the country doing them, because injustice to one people is injustice to all of humanity. But at the same time, there's a dark side to all of this. When you get into this mentality, understand, while it is important to recognize the evils of Israel, while it is important to recognize the Judaizing heresy of Christian Zionism, understand that there is a very dark path that is paved from this position. Understand that there is a chance of people going down a dark path from there. And by that, I mean praising Adolf Hitler. Recognizing Israeli war crimes, absolutely, I'm right there with you. But here is the problem. People will begin to think, and people are already thinking this, wait a second. Israel's evil. The Holocaust happened, but we were told that the Holocaust happened. We were told that Israel had to be formed as a response to the Holocaust. And so the roots of Israel is the Holocaust. That means the Holocaust must have been made up because Israel is evil, and Israel has made up lies and fabricated things and fabricated propaganda to get us to go to war. And Israel has been lying about its treatment of the Palestinians, so that must mean the Holocaust is a lie, and let's just ignore all the evidence for the Holocaust, and let's get into Holocaust denialism. And the danger is very obvious. People are going down the path of Hitlerianism. They are going down the path of Nazism. And that's the dark side in all of this. You see, you have to look at the bright side of things, but you also have to acknowledge the dark side of things. It's good that people are waking up to the evils of Israel, but all evil is done through the justification of pointing to other evils. Well, we're doing this evil because this other country did this evil. Evil points to other evils to justify its own existence. Evil regimes, evil ideologies always point to the abuses done by others to justify its own existence. Okay, France invaded England and butchered English civilians, and so the English said, okay, we're going to declare war on France. England invades France, commencing the 100 Years' War, and then England became the monster and started doing horrendous atrocities on the French people. Communists did terrible things in Germany after World War I, and the Bolsheviks rose up and they were butchering people in various countries. And so the Nazis said, we have to fight against the Bolshevik terror. So the Nazis went to war against the Bolsheviks, but then did a whole bunch of war crimes in the process, did a whole bunch of atrocities and genocides in the process. Evil regimes and ideologies will always use the faults of others, or they will always use the evil deeds of others to justify their own evils. And we have to keep in mind of this reality. We have to be aware of this reality, because if we are not, we will fall for the trap of Nazism, and that is what is happening. And you see Tucker Carlson inviting this Daryl Cooper guy, and Daryl Cooper is saying, well, Churchill was this terrible, evil person. Yes, Churchill was evil, but what is the end game? What is the motivation? And then you see this Daryl Cooper guy posting this meme on his X account, and he shows a picture of the Nazis in France, and then he shows a picture of some totally the opposite. He shows a picture of these transgender people, and he says, oh, I would much prefer the Nazis over the transgenders. Okay, transgenderism is bad, don't get me wrong, not supporting it, but what is your end goal here? And the way I look at this is that this is a strategy of pointing to the evils of others to justify another evil. Transgenderism doesn't justify Nazism. It's just the bottom line. It doesn't justify Nazism. Plus, to be perfectly honest, if I had to choose between living under a Nazi regime and living in a society where transgenderism is allowed, I'm going to be honest, and I'm probably going to get a bunch of spite from people for this, but I'll pick the latter of the two. Now, why do I say this? While both are evil, the Nazis are way more competent than the transgender people. Let's be real here. The transgenders failed in convincing the American population to follow their agenda. The whole LGBT movement managed to get Target and other stores to put LGBT paraphernalia in their stores, and then what happened? You don't really see so much of that anymore because the transgenders managed to piss off the American population. The Nazis, on the other hand, they managed to grip the hearts of all the German people. They managed to grip the hearts of much of Europe because they were much more effective in propaganda and rhetoric. So the Nazis were extremely proficient in propaganda, extremely proficient in aesthetics, convincing people of their ideology, and plus they were much more systematic in their evil ways, and they were extremely competent. And that competence enabled them to commit horrific acts of mass murder. So what's the end goal here of pointing to transgenderism to talk about how much you love the aesthetics of Nazis? What's the end goal? That's the question. What is the intention behind this sort of memology, so to speak? It's to get people to soften up to Nazism. That is the end goal. That is the agenda. Bottom line. So the train has been set. As I said in my last video, we can't stop what's coming. Nazism is reviving. Holocaust denialism continues to grow in popularity. The train has been set, and we cannot stop what's coming. We can't. The Israelis can complain all they want. Adam Sosnick can complain all he wants. The more they complain, the more hatred they're going to receive. The more they complain, the more attention they give to the anti-Semites and to the pro-Palestine people and to the Holocaust deniers. The more the pro-Israel people complain, the more attention they give to their enemies. And as long as their enemies get attention, they have the limelight and they have a platform from which to speak and from which to exclaim their ideas. And they continue to win. If the pro-Israel people and if the Jewish organizations say nothing, then their enemies will just be speaking without any sort of opposition, and they will continue to win. So this is an absolute lose-lose situation for Israel and the pro-Israel crowd. Bottom line is, Israel is facing its end, and you have America's Turkish ally in the Middle East, who is necessary for Turkey, who is necessary for the United States to go against the Russians. The Americans want to use the Turks as a proxy against the Russians, so the Americans need the Turks. Regardless of how much the Turks hate Israel, it doesn't matter. So to fight Russia, America is empowering the Turks, even though this is to really the demise of Israel. And then at the same time, you have the rise of the Germans, and the Americans want to use the Germans as a proxy, regardless of the fact that Nazism is seeing a comeback in Germany, and this is why you have the AfD party being the second biggest party in Germany, and the most popular leader of the AfD is Björn Höcke, who is a man who sympathizes with the Third Reich. So we see this anti-Israel fanaticism in Turkey, and at the same time, America is having to empower Turkey because America needs Turkey to go against the Russians. Then at the same time, we see these Nazis in Germany getting very powerful, and America is backing the Nazis. That's why you see J.D. Vance supporting them. That's why you see Elon Musk supporting them. The Americans are backing the Nazis in Germany, and at the same time, they are supporting the revival of German militarism. This is why Elon Musk said that Germans need to stop really focusing so much on history, stop focusing on the Holocaust, and become independent militarily. So the Americans are pushing for this revival of German militarism. Meanwhile, they're pushing for German nationalism, regardless of the fact that German nationalism is filled with Nazis. So in both sides of this strategy, the German side and the Turkish side, you see people who hate Jews and you see people who hate Israel. The Americans are empowering both of them. And so you see this perfect storm being done at the behest of the United States. And at the end of the day, this is to the demise of Israel. At the end of the day, America, whether it knows it or not, or whether it gives a shit or not, America is paving the path for Israel's destruction. And Israel is paving its own path towards destruction because Israel continues on with its arrogance. It continues pushing Palestinians out of their homes. It continues to slaughter Palestinians in Gaza. And it doesn't give a damn if the world grows in its hatred towards Israel. It doesn't care because it thinks, well, America's always going to be on our side. Well, here comes Turkey. And here is the rise of the Nazis in Germany. We are literally heading towards a massive quagmire of a nightmare. Anyway, I've talked long enough. I really wanted to get these thoughts out. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.